The Zirian commander's laughter echoed through the hangar bay like a bad sitcom laugh track. The towering, scaled officer known as Commander Voric, a decorated war veteran, wiped tears from his reptilian eyes. His soldiers followed suit, cackling and hissing as they surrounded the man at the center of their mockery, Sergeant James, Eagle Eye, Westcott. James stood firm, holding his rifle, a battered, old bolt-action relic that had seen better days. Its wooden stock was scratched, the metal worn from years of use. To the Zirian warriors, who wielded sleek plasma rifles and energy cannons, the sight of this toy was laughable. "That's your weapon?" Voric sneered, flicking his clawed finger against the rifle's barrel. "What is this? A musket?" His soldiers roared with laughter again. James kept his face calm. He was used to this. Ever since the Zyra coalition had visited Earth in search of skilled fighters to aid in their war against the Drawl swarm, he'd been facing this ridicule. Earth's weapons were seen as primitive junk. But James knew something they didn't. It wasn't just about the weapon. It was about the man behind it. "You want me to demonstrate?" James asked casually, voice low and steady. Voric leaned closer, his scaly face just inches from James. "I'd rather watch you load that thing with gunpowder and a stick." More laughter. James smirked. Without another word, he slung the rifle over his shoulder and began walking toward the firing range. The soldiers followed, still laughing, eager to see this Earth barbarian humiliate himself. The range was lined with glowing blue energy targets. The furthest one, almost 2 miles away, was barely visible. Even Zirian snipers struggled to hit that one, and they were using high-tech scopes with computer-assisted aiming systems. James calmly knelt, resting his rifle on a cracked metal crate. He licked his thumb, held it up to test the wind, then adjusted his rifle's scope, a scratched, manual piece of glass that seemed pathetic next to the Zirian technology. "No computers," Voric chuckled to his soldiers. "He's guessing." James ignored the jeers, exhaling slowly as his finger hovered over the trigger. The air was still. His heartbeat slowed. The world seemed to shrink until only the distant target remained. In that frozen moment, James squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the range. The Zirian soldiers watched with smug grins, until the distant target flared red, a perfect bullseye. Silence. The laughter stopped. Voric's smile vanished. "You got lucky," Voric growled. James turned, resting his rifle across his shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "Real lucky." He started walking away, ignoring the stunned expressions around him. The Zirian soldiers muttered among themselves. They knew what they'd seen. No luck could account for that shot. The next day, James found himself summoned to the War Council. He stood at attention before the towering figure of General Threx, the leader of the Zyra coalition's military. Commander Voric stood nearby, arms crossed, glaring at James with barely concealed contempt. "I hear you've impressed some of my soldiers," Threx said, his voice like grinding metal. "But war is more than just trick shots. Our weapons are engineered for precision. Yours is a piece of scrap." "Scrap works," James replied. "Especially when you know how to use it." Voric snorted. "I doubt you could outshoot one of my best snipers in real combat." James gave a lopsided grin. "Want to put money on that?" The room fell quiet. Zirians value pride over everything, and a direct challenge like that was impossible to ignore. Voric's scaled hand clenched the hilt of his ceremonial blade. "Fine," Voric hissed. "One shot. One target. If you win, you're in. If you lose, you get sent back to Earth where you belong." James nodded. "Deal." The following morning, the soldiers gathered at the range again, this time buzzing with excitement. Word had spread that Earth's sniper was about to face off against one of the Zirian elite. The target was set, a tiny metal sphere suspended by a drone, drifting erratically half a mile away. The air buzzed with tension. Voric's chosen sniper, a stone-faced alien named Draktor, took his position first. Draktor's rifle hummed as its computer-controlled scope locked onto the moving target. He fired. The sphere exploded in a bright blue flash. The crowd erupted in cheers. James didn't blink. He knelt beside his crate again, this time adjusting the elevation knob on his old scope. The wind had shifted, slightly northeast, he noticed, and he whispered calculations to himself. The drone twisted and veered erratically, and James waited, tracking its chaotic motion. He fired. The sphere didn't just break, it shattered into a cloud of tiny fragments, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke. The crowd's stunned silence felt almost louder than their previous laughter. Voric's jaw tightened. "Beginner's luck," he growled. "That's 2 shots of luck," James replied. "Care to test a third?" The murmurs in the crowd turned into murmurs of respect. Soldiers began whispering his new nickname, Eagle Eye. Later that evening, as James cleaned his rifle alone in his bunk, a shadow fell across his door. It was Lieutenant Ryla, one of the few Xyrian officers who had shown no hostility toward him. "You're not what I expected," Ryla said quietly. "Most humans we've seen think war is about charging and guns blazing. But you're different." "I know my limits," James replied. "But I also know what I can do." "You may have won the match," Ryla said. "But Voric, he's not going to let this go. He's proud, and he's dangerous when he's angry." James chuckled dryly. "I figured. Just watch your back," Ryla warned, then left. James stared at his rifle, fingers tracing the worn wooden stock. This old thing had saved his life more times than he could count. The Xyrians could mock it all they wanted, but James knew what counted most: patience, precision, and a steady hand. He didn't know what dangers lay ahead, but whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. If they underestimated him again, they wouldn't live to regret it. The journey to Draal Prime began with a cold silence hanging over the crew. The Xyrian warship, sleek and metallic, hummed faintly as it soared through hyperspace. James sat at the edge of the mess hall, quietly cleaning his rifle. The alien soldiers kept their distance, though their eyes often flicked toward him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. Word of his remarkable shot had spread quickly, yet respect was still hard-earned. To most of them, he was still an Earth soldier, a human anomaly with a primitive weapon. Lieutenant Ryla sat across from him, her sharp violet eyes scanning the room. She seemed to be one of the few who didn't outright resent him, though her expressions never gave much away. James noticed that her gaze kept shifting toward Commander Voric, who stood brooding in the corner. Voric's resentment still simmered just beneath the surface, and the way his soldiers whispered around him made it clear he wasn't planning to let the humiliation of his defeat go unanswered. "You should eat," Ryla said finally, motioning to the untouched tray in front of James. James glanced down at the gelatinous blue substance on his plate. Xyrian rations. It wobbled slightly when the ship hit turbulence. "I'd rather lick battery acid," James muttered, earning a short laugh from Ryla. "I wouldn't recommend it," she said. "Xyrian batteries are aggressive." The ship's intercom crackled, and the voice of General Threx filled the room. "All strike teams to briefing station. Mission details will be outlined shortly." The mess hall emptied fast, and James found himself trailing behind the heavily armored Xyrian soldiers. He clutched his rifle tightly. They'd let him in, sure, but he knew most of them still expected him to fail. If this mission went south, they'd be quick to blame the Earth sniper. In the war room, a holographic map flickered to life, revealing Draal Prime's twisted landscape, a jagged maze of blackened rock and glowing red fissures. The planet was a living furnace, its unstable crust riddled with volcanic eruptions and toxic storms. The Draal Hive Queen resided deep within a fortress guarded by thousands of drones. Taking her out would cripple the swarm, but getting to her was the hard part. "We'll split into 3 squads," General Threx barked. "Each will take a separate infiltration route. Intelligence suggests the Queen's Guard patrols rotate every 30 minutes. Timing is everything." James studied the map closely. One of the routes, a narrow pass along a ravine, seemed ideal for a sniper, provided he could reach the right vantage point. He felt Ryla's eyes on him and knew she was thinking the same thing. Voric's voice cut through the room. Put the human on the decoy squad, he said coldly. That should keep him out of our way. Actually, Ryla countered, he's better suited to overwatch. His rifle may be outdated, but his precision could make a difference. Voric's jaw tightened, but Threx overruled him. Fine. But if he slows us down, leave him behind. James bit back a grin. He'd faced worse odds before. When they reached Drawl Prime's surface, the air stung like acid and heat radiated from the ground in waves. Jagged spires of obsidian jutted from the ground, and rivers of molten rock twisted between them like veins of fire. The sky churned with ash, and visibility was poor. The perfect storm for disaster. James followed his team through the maze of blackened stone, his rifle slung low. The Zyrians moved in silent precision, each step deliberate. James stayed back, scanning the ridges above for movement. The Drawl swarm was notorious for its ambush tactics. They attacked in waves, overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers. The first attack came suddenly. Without warning, figures erupted from the rocks, insected warriors with jagged limbs and glistening carapaces. Plasma fire filled the air as the Zyrians opened fire. Their sleek weapons spat bolts of blue energy, but the Drawl's armor shrugged off most of the blasts. James dropped to one knee, rifle snapping to his shoulder. He sighted a Drawl soldier climbing a ridge and squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, and the creature's head snapped back. It toppled like a rag doll. James shifted to the next target, a drone flanking the Zyrians, and dropped it with another precise shot. The Zyrians, still locked in close combat, didn't notice at first. It wasn't until the tide of the fight shifted that they realized what was happening. Ryla saw him first, her eyes widening as she followed the path of his shots, each one surgical, each one landing with deadly precision. When the fight ended, James lowered his rifle, breathing heavily. The rocky pass was littered with twitching Drawl bodies. For a moment, the Zyrians stood quietly, as if unsure whether to thank him or challenge him. Voric pushed through the crowd, glaring at James. You were supposed to hold position. I did, James said calmly. You just didn't realize that position was behind you. Voric's fists clenched, but Ryla stepped between them. He saved your life, she said firmly. Don't forget that. The group pressed on, the tension growing thicker with each step. As they neared the Queen's fortress, James noticed Voric quietly speaking to two of his soldiers. They whispered in hushed tones, occasionally glancing back at him. Something was wrong. Later that night, while the others rested, James sat sharpening his knife. He heard footsteps behind him and turned just in time to see Ryla approaching. Voric's planning something, she said quietly. I heard him say he doesn't plan to let you walk away from this mission. James sighed, unsurprised. I figured. You should leave, Ryla urged. Get out before it's too late. James shook his head. Not until this job's done. The next morning, the team reached the outer perimeter of the Queen's lair, a twisted spire of obsidian surrounded by sulphurous vents. The plan was simple. Voric's team would lead the frontal assault while James provided sniper cover. But just before they moved out, Voric's voice came through James' comms. Change of plans? Voric growled. Stay behind. We don't need you. James frowned, then felt a sudden tremor beneath his boots. A deafening crack split the air as the ground collapsed beneath him. Rocks tumbled, and he was swallowed into darkness. He landed hard in a narrow crevice, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hands. Dust choked his lungs as he stumbled to his feet. The crevice stretched into a winding tunnel, too far down to climb out. He knew exactly what had happened. Voric had set this up. He wanted James out of the way, or dead. James coughed, steadying himself. He reached for his radio, but static hissed back at him. No signal. He was alone. Or so he thought. From the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes flickered, Drawl scouts. James backed up slowly, his rifle raised. The creatures clicked and chittered, moving closer. James exhaled slowly, steadying his aim. All right, he muttered to himself. Let's see what this scrap can do. The first shot rang out, echoing through the tunnel. The tunnel seemed to breathe with its own unnatural rhythm. James stood motionless, his rifle pressed tightly to his shoulder. The two glowing eyes in the shadows flickered again as the Droll scout shifted. Its jagged limbs scraped against the stone, its chittering voice a constant reminder that more could be nearby. James held his breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound swallowing every other noise in the tunnel. The shot struck true, shattering the scout's face with a sickening crunch. The creature convulsed and collapsed in a heap. Before James could even lower his weapon, another shape darted into view, another scout, faster than the first. He shifted his aim, fired again, and the second scout crumpled to the floor. For a few tense seconds, the tunnel returned to silence. James exhaled slowly and crouched beside the fallen Droll, checking the twisted bodies. Both scouts carried crude signaling devices attached to their armor. James grimaced. If these were scouts, more would come soon, possibly a full swarm. He didn't have time to waste. The tunnel stretched on in both directions, jagged and winding. James flicked on a small flashlight strapped to his rifle and pressed forward. His boots crunched softly on loose gravel as the air grew hotter with each step. The sulphurous stench of the volcanic terrain clung to his lungs, making each breath a struggle. Sweat trickled down his face, and his fatigue stuck to his back. His mind kept circling back to Voric. The collapse wasn't an accident, the timing was too perfect. Voric had set him up, and the soldiers had obeyed him without question. James felt his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had risked his life to prove himself, and still, they treated him like an expendable nuisance. Fine. If they didn't believe in him, he'd survive on his own. Hours seemed to pass as he followed the tunnel's winding path. He paused only to sip water from his canteen, mindful of his dwindling supply. Then, ahead of him, faint voices echoed through the stone. He crept forward, hugging the wall as the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. Smoke drifted from cracks in the rock, and faint blue lights flickered, Xerian equipment. James moved closer and saw a familiar figure standing near a terminal, Lieutenant Ryla. She stood alone, whispering urgently into her comm unit. James crept closer, his voice low but firm. Ryla. She jumped, spinning around with her weapon raised. Her eyes widened when she recognized him. James? You're alive? She lowered her rifle and hurried toward him. What happened? Voric said you. She trailed off, her face tightening as realization set in. Yeah, James muttered. He tried to bury me. I knew something was wrong, she said, her voice sharp with anger. He told Threx that you abandoned your post and fled. They think you're a coward. James chuckled darkly. That sounds about right. There's more, Ryla added. Voric's squad pushed ahead early. They bypassed the Queen's main guard and are already inside the fortress. But they don't know about the Queen's sensory node. James's breath caught. During their earlier briefing, he'd spotted a crucial detail the others had missed. The Queen's armor was impenetrable, but her sensory node, a small organ exposed near her upper spine, was vulnerable. It was faintly visible under ultraviolet light, something Xerian scopes couldn't detect, but James's old Earth-built scope, designed for tracking heat and movement, had shown it clearly. They're walking into a death trap, James said. They'll never see the weak point. Ryla nodded grimly. Voric's pride won't let him retreat. They'll keep fighting until they're wiped out. James tightened his grip on his rifle. Not if I get there first. Together they moved through the winding tunnels, their pace quick but cautious. The sounds of distant combat grew louder, bursts of plasma fire, and the screeching cries of the Droll soldiers. When they finally reached the outer wall of the Queen's chamber, James found exactly what he feared: Voric's squad pinned down, trapped in a narrow corridor by waves of Droll drones. Voric stood at the front, barking orders while his soldiers fell one by one. James scanned the battlefield, his eyes locking on the towering figure of the Droll Queen. She loomed above the chaos, her armored form glistening like obsidian. Drones swarmed around her, protecting her from the onslaught. But James saw what the others couldn't, that faint, glowing node flickering beneath her thick armor. "I've got a shot," James whispered. Ryla stared at him in disbelief. "Through all that chaos? You'd have to be insane." "Yeah," James muttered, adjusting his scope. "I get that a lot." He climbed a jagged ledge for a better angle, finding a perch high above the battlefield. The Drawl drones moved in constant, chaotic patterns, but James stayed calm, breathing slow and steady. He adjusted for wind, distance, and heat distortion. The Queen shifted, and for a brief second, her vulnerable node flickered into view. James fired. The crack of his rifle seemed deafening amid the roar of battle. The shot ripped through the air and struck the Queen's node dead center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then her body spasmed violently, her limbs twitching as the energy that controlled her drones faltered. The swarm faltered with her, collapsing into disorganized confusion. The remaining Xyrian soldiers seized the opportunity, cutting down the weakened Drawl forces with ruthless precision. By the time the smoke cleared, the Queen's massive form lay sprawled across the stone floor, motionless. The battlefield was littered with twisted drones, and the surviving Xyrians stood panting, exhausted but victorious. Voric staggered toward James, his face twisted with rage. "You disobeyed orders!" he snapped. "You had no right." "I just saved your squad," James interrupted coldly. "You would have been slaughtered if I hadn't taken that shot." Voric's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, General Threx's voice crackled through their calms. "Status report?" Ryla grabbed her calm. "The Queen is down. Victory confirmed." Threx's voice softened with relief. "Acknowledged. Return to the warship immediately." As they began the long march back, the surviving Xyrian soldiers glanced at James with a new sense of respect. Some nodded quietly in gratitude. Even Voric, still simmering with anger, kept his mouth shut. Hours later, back aboard the ship, General Threx called James aside. The towering commander's face was unreadable as he studied the man before him. "You defied orders," Threx said at last. "But you saved my soldiers. That's not something I can ignore." James shrugged. "I don't follow orders blindly. I follow what's right." For a long moment, Threx said nothing. Then, to James's surprise, the general's scaled hand reached out in salute. "You've earned your place here, Eagle Eye." James grinned and returned the salute. "Just doing my job." As he walked back to his quarters, he couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. Something still didn't sit right. Voric's attempt to eliminate him wasn't just about pride, there was more to it. And deep down, James knew this war wasn't over. Something worse was coming, and for some reason, they would need him again. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight settle across his back. Whatever came next, he was ready. The Xyrian warship drifted silently through the void, the glow of distant stars flickering across its metallic hull. James sat alone in the ship's observation deck, his rifle resting on his lap. The worn wooden stock felt comforting in his hands, familiar, steady. The chaos of the mission still lingered in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to let it go, the image of Voric's face kept resurfacing. The commander's fury wasn't just personal pride, there was something deeper, something dangerous. James knew better than to believe that the tension had ended with the Queen's death. The door behind him slid open with a soft hiss, and Lieutenant Ryla stepped inside. Her usually sharp expression was softer now, her violet eyes betraying something close to concern. She crossed her arms and leaned against the wall, studying him for a moment before speaking. "You should be celebrating with the others," she said. "They're calling you a hero now." James chuckled dryly. "Yeah? Funny how fast that changes." "You earned it," Ryla replied. "If you hadn't taken that shot, none of us would have made it back." She paused. "Even Voric knows that." "Voric doesn't know anything," James muttered. "He's still looking for a way to get me out of his way." Ryla frowned, stepping closer. "I know you think this is just about pride, but..." I don't think that's all of it. Voric's been meeting with someone, off record. Someone outside the Zyrian chain of command. James sat up, his fingers tightening around his rifle. Who? I don't know, Ryla admitted. But whatever it is, it's not good. Before James could respond, the ship's alarm blared, and the intercom crackled with General Threx's urgent voice. All units to battle stations. Incoming threat approaching from Sector 9. James shot to his feet, slinging his rifle over his shoulder as he and Ryla hurried toward the war room. The ship's corridors buzzed with frantic soldiers preparing for battle, and the air felt heavier with each step. When they reached the war room, the holographic display revealed the source of the threat, a fleet of sleek, black ships cutting through space like knives. That's not the drawl, Ryla said, her voice low. No, James muttered. It's worse. The ships bore no markings, no colors, just cold black hulls moving with eerie precision. They advanced in a tight formation, and their numbers vastly outmatched the Zyrian fleet. General Threx's voice carried across the room. They haven't responded to hails, and their weapons are primed. Prepare for battle. The ship shuddered as the first wave of energy blasts struck their shields. James and Ryla barely kept their footing as the warship returned fire. Explosions flared outside the observation windows, debris spinning away into the void. The enemy's tactics were brutal, no hesitation, no mercy. They weren't here for negotiation, they were here to wipe them out. James followed Ryla toward the armory, grabbing additional ammunition and supplies. The ship's alarms continued to scream as the battle intensified. Explosions rocked the hull, and the metallic groan of twisting metal filled the air. James knew the ship wouldn't last long at this rate. As they reached the main hangar, James saw Voric rallying his soldiers, barking orders with cold precision. The commander's face was grim, yet there was something else beneath his scowl, something closer to satisfaction. You! Voric spat when he spotted James. Stay out of my way. Yeah, James said bitterly. That's been working out great so far. Before Voric could answer, the hangar doors shuddered violently. The energy shields rippled and collapsed, and suddenly the enemy troops were upon them. Black armored soldiers swarmed into the hangar, their armor sleek and jagged. They moved with terrifying precision, wielding weapons that hissed and crackled with glowing blue energy. James dropped behind a supply crate, raising his rifle and picking his targets carefully. The enemy soldiers didn't move like the drawl. There was no chaos in their assault, only cold efficiency. Every shot they fired was calculated, their tactics precise. James found his rhythm, lining up each shot with precision. His rifle barked again and again, dropping enemies with deadly accuracy. The Zyrians fought fiercely, but they were being overwhelmed. For every enemy that fell, two more seemed to take their place. Then James saw it, a shadow moving along the far side of the hangar. A figure in black armor, taller than the rest, slipped through the chaos, moving directly toward the ship's power core. The figure carried a cylindrical device strapped to its back, some kind of explosive. Ryla! James shouted, pointing toward the infiltrator. Cover me! Without waiting for a response, he sprinted through the chaos, weaving between gunfire and explosions. He reached a vantage point and knelt behind a crate, sighting down his scope. The infiltrator knelt beside the core, activating the device. James took a breath, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The round hit home, striking the infiltrator's head just above the neck. The black-armored soldier dropped instantly, and the device clattered to the floor. But James knew something was wrong. The device's timer was still counting down. Ryla reached him just as he sprinted toward the explosive. The display glowed red, numbers ticking rapidly toward 0. James knelt, frantically scanning the device. The mechanism was alien, its symbols unreadable. I can't shut this down, James muttered. I don't even know what half of this is. Then we'll have to move it, Ryla said urgently. James grabbed the device, barely able to lift its heavy frame. Together they dragged it toward the emergency airlock. Voric appeared in front of them, rifle raised. Drop it, Voric growled. Are you insane? Ryla barked. This thing's going to blow the whole ship. You should have stayed in that tunnel. Voric sneered at James. This war's bigger than you, bigger than all of us. You're working with them, James realized. You sold us out. Voric's expression twisted into a wicked grin. The Zirians are weak. These new allies, they're the future. And you? He sneered at James's rifle. You're just a relic. James didn't hesitate. He let go of the device with one hand and fired. The shot slammed into Voric's chest, and the traitorous commander crumpled to the floor. Together, James and Ryla heaved the explosive into the airlock. James slammed his fist against the control panel, and the heavy doors sealed shut. The airlock ejected the device into the void just seconds before it detonated. The explosion flared brilliantly outside the ship, and the shockwave rocked the entire vessel. The black armored fleet began to retreat soon after, their precision suddenly faltering without their infiltrators guiding them. The surviving Zirians rallied, driving back the attackers. By the time the battle ended, the hangar was littered with debris and bodies. Later, as James sat quietly in the med bay with his rifle across his lap, Ryla appeared again. She stood silently for a moment, then smiled faintly. You were right, she said. Voric wasn't just arrogant, he was a traitor. The silence in the aftermath of battle felt almost unnatural. The twisted metal, the scorched walls, and the faint smell of ozone from energy blasts still lingered in the air. The Zirian warship drifted slowly through the void, battered but still intact. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the damage, welding hull fractures and restoring damaged systems. James sat quietly on a crate in the hangar, his rifle resting across his lap. His fingers absently traced the worn wood of the stock, his mind replaying the last few hours like a film on repeat. He kept seeing Voric's face. That twisted grin, the smug satisfaction just before James had pulled the trigger. The memory unsettled him. Voric's betrayal was more than just pride or anger, it was something deeper, calculated and cold. Someone had gotten to him, convinced him that betraying his own people was worth the risk. And that meant whoever was behind this wasn't finished. Footsteps echoed in the hangar, and James glanced up to see Ryla approaching. Her uniform was streaked with soot, and there was a fresh gash along her arm, hastily bandaged. Despite her exhaustion, her eyes were sharp. Figured I'd find you here, she said quietly. James grunted in response, glancing back at his rifle. Just thinking. You should get some rest, Ryla said, folding her arms. The others are barely standing. I can't, James muttered. Something's still off. This wasn't just an attack, it was a test. Ryla's expression darkened as she sat down beside him. You think they'll come back? They will, James said. They weren't just here to destroy the ship, they were here to see what we could do. And now they know how we fight. Ryla leaned forward, her voice lowering. I did some digging before the attack. Voric wasn't just working with those black-armored soldiers. He'd been passing intel for weeks, feeding them details about our fleet movements, weaknesses, everything. James clenched his fists. So this was never a simple mission, they knew exactly where we'd be. There's more, Ryla continued. Voric was sending intel to a relay station near the Epsilon Drift, neutral territory. Whatever he was planning, he wasn't working alone. James felt the weight of the revelation settle in his chest. If Voric's betrayal was just a piece of something bigger, then the real threat hadn't even revealed itself yet. Before they could speak further, the ship's intercom crackled, and General Threx's voice filled the hangar. All officers report to the war room immediately. Priority briefing. James and Ryla exchanged a look and hurried toward the command deck. The war room was already packed when they arrived, soldiers and officers gathered around the holographic display at the center of the room. The image flickered, displaying a barren planet orbiting a dying red star. Jagged rock formations and deep canyons stretched across its surface, and a strange metallic structure stood in the center of the wasteland. This, Threx said grimly, is the source of the signal Voric was transmitting to. Our scouts picked up unusual energy readings from this site 2 hours ago. Whatever Voric was planning, it started here. The display zoomed in, revealing a fortress-like structure half buried in the planet's rocky crust. Pulsing energy lines glowed faintly along its surface, suggesting advanced technology, far beyond anything the Xyrians had seen before. We'll send a strike team to investigate, Threx continued. If there's any remaining data, we need to recover it before it falls into enemy hands. I'll go, James said firmly. The room turned quiet. Several officers glanced at him with uncertainty, but Threx's expression remained unreadable. You've done enough, Threx said. Rest. Let my soldiers handle this. With respect, James countered. You're sending those soldiers in blind. Whatever's down there, whoever these people are, they know us. They know how we fight. They'll expect energy weapons, drones, and tactics straight out of the Xyrian playbook. What they won't expect is me. Threx studied him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. You've got one shot, he said. Don't waste it. Hours later, James found himself seated in the cramped interior of a Xyrian dropship, feeling the steady thrum of the engines beneath his boots. Ryla sat beside him, checking her rifle for the 4th time. You sure about this? She asked. I don't see anyone else lining up for the job, James replied dryly. The dropship jolted as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Flames licked the windows as the ship punched through the thick clouds, and the rocky surface below grew closer with each second. The fortress appeared on the horizon, a jagged structure of black metal and twisted spires. Whatever it was, it had no obvious doors or windows. The place seemed less like a building and more like a wound carved into the planet itself. The dropship landed hard on the rocky surface, and the team filed out in formation. James stayed back, scanning the area with his rifle. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying with it the scent of scorched earth. Ryla moved ahead with the rest of the team while James climbed a narrow ridge for a better view. He found a perch overlooking the fortress and knelt, raising his scope. The entrance revealed itself moments later, a hidden hatch disguised as a rock formation. As the Xyrian soldiers moved closer, the hatch hissed open, and the enemy soldiers spilled out. They moved like phantoms, silent, fast, and deadly. Blades flicked through the air, and the ambush was swift. James exhaled slowly and fired. The shot hit home, dropping one of the attackers before they could strike. He adjusted his aim and fired again, another enemy down. The Xyrians rallied, pushing forward with renewed determination. Plasma fire streaked through the air, and James kept firing, picking off targets one by one. Then he saw something else, a figure in the distance, cloaked and watching. The figure wasn't fighting, they were observing. James adjusted his scope, trying to get a better look, but before he could, the figure turned and vanished into the shadows. Moments later, the enemy forces retreated, leaving behind their fallen. The Xyrians regrouped, gathering what data they could from the fortress's terminal. James joined Ryla at the entrance, scanning the area one last time. You see him too? Ryla asked quietly. Yeah, James muttered. He wasn't here to fight. He was watching. Watching what? Me, James said grimly. He wanted to see how I shoot. Back aboard the warship, the recovered data confirmed their worst fears. The enemy was building something, a fleet larger than anything the Xyrians had ever faced. And worse, they knew about James. His call sign, Eagle Eye, had been listed in their tactical records. They know who you are, Ryla said quietly. Good, James replied, resting his rifle across his lap. Because now I know who they are. Ryla raised an eyebrow. And who's that? James exhaled, the weight of what was coming settling heavily on his shoulders. Dead men, he said. They just don't know it yet.